My name is Neil Johnson from Wellington City Libraries, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this very special question and answer online session with Professor Val McDermid. Professor Val McDermid is one of the biggest names in crime writing. Her novels have sold millions of copies and have been translated into 40 languages. Val McDermid has published so far 27 novels, in addition to short stories, non-fiction, radio plays, and an award-winning children's book called My Granny is a Pirate. She is often regarded as the modern queen of crime. Her books at this point feature four main series: Lindsay Gordon, Kate Brannigan, DCI Karen Prairie, and the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan series, which were made into the highly successful TV series Wire in the Blood. Professor McDermid has won the crime writer's most prestigious award, the much coveted Crime Writers Association Golden Dagger for Best Crime Novel of the Year for The Mermaid Singing, as well as a plethora of other awards. Val McDermid grew up in Cookbook on the east coast of Scotland, in a small town famous for producing linoleum and also being the birthplace of the economist Adam Smith. She also holds an honorary fellowship for St Hilda's College, Oxford, where she studied and was the first ever student from a state school in Scotland to attend. Val said of her time in Oxford, "I survived the culture shock of arriving in a place where no one understood a word I said and seized every experience I could get my hands on." Val is also a keen Wraith Rovers fan. Her father was a scout for the team, and Val is also a regular broadcaster for BBC Radio, as well as recently a COVID lockdown celebrity chef. So it just remains for me to say a very heartfelt thank you, Val, for doing this, and to Joe, who has kindly agreed to ask the questions on our behalf in the Scotland end. A very warm welcome to a virtual New Zealand, Professor McDermid, a country I know you know very well.
Thanks, Neil. It's an absolute delight to be here, even if it's only virtually, in the Wellington City Library. Uh, I had such a wonderful time when we visited New Zealand in 2019, and I couldn't wait to get back. And of course, unfortunately, events overtook us, and we weren't able to come back last year. We're still hoping we might manage to make it back to New Zealand this year. I've had my first vaccination. Second one should arrive fairly soon, and we may make it back yet. So fingers crossed, and if you've got any pull with the New Zealand government, get stuck in there. We're going to do a series of question and answers, and my partner Jo is going to read the questions. She's also the person behind the camera, and if any of you have watched Cooking the Books, our cooking spectaculars, you'll be familiar with her sarcastic remarks, which I've told her to keep to a minimum today, but doubtless that she will appear at some point.
Okay, so question one. As a library, we are always interested in the authors and novels that formed a writer. What did you read when you were growing up, and how did that influence you?
The short answer is I read everything I could get my hands on. My mum used to take me to the library when I was very small, before I could read, and she'd take me across the council estate in my pushchair to Temple Hall Library in Kirkcaldy, where I grew up, and she'd read picture books to me. I actually used to go to the library before I could say library. I used to say apparently we were going to the Labrador, because that was the kind of dog we had. But when I was 6 years old, they did me the great favour of moving down the town to live opposite the Central Library. I don't think that was the sole purpose of their move, but it worked out very well for me. And the library became my home from home. I just read my way round the shelves. I was completely indiscriminating. If it was on the shelf and it looked all right, I'd have a crack at it. But because this was Scotland in the 1960s, there was a notion that you shouldn't have unmitigated pleasure. So although you could take 4 books out at a time, 2 of them had to be non-fiction to improve yourself. As a result of that, I read many things that otherwise I probably wouldn't have taken off the shelves. Natural history, geography, history, poetry, drama, all kinds of things crossed my shelf. And I suppose one of the things that did for me was open my horizons to a wider world. But I also read humongous amounts of fiction. everything from Enid Blyton onwards, Biggles, Billy Bunter, but most of all, the books I loved were the Shalley School books. This was a series of girls' school stories set first in Austria, then later in Switzerland. And you can't see the shelves on the other side of the room there. There's a whole shelf of Shalley School books still there. And I learned a lot of things from the Shalley School books. I mean, I read many books in my childhood that I loved and that changed the way I looked at the world. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, for example, remains the book I would take with me to a desert island because it's a book that has everything. But the Shalley School books, strangely enough, taught me about life. You wouldn't think that a wee working class lassie in Fife would get her life lessons from possibly the most middle class fiction you could imagine. But for me, it served a lot of purposes. Although I didn't understand it at the time, it taught me the nature of proper series fiction. Although things like The Famous Five and Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys are supposed to be series, they're not series in the sense that everything happens in the same summer and nothing that happens has any impact on anybody in the book. Nobody ever says, oh, we mustn't go back into that dark cave because the last time we went into a dark cave, something terrible happened to us. There's no reflection and nobody gets any older. But with the Shalley School books, time passes. Each book is either a term or a year in the life of the school, and events have consequences. If you break your leg tobogganing in one book, you're still limping 3 books later. But of course, because this was the library, you could never manage to read them in sequence. So it was like a giant jigsaw puzzle. I'd grab whatever Shalley School book was on the shelf and I'd read it. And at some point there would be a moment where I'd go, oh, that's why she behaves like that, or that's what happened to make this happen. And over a period of time, I kind of pieced together, like a giant jigsaw, the story of the books and these characters. It also had other important influences on me, particularly the understanding that being a writer was a job. Because one of the characters in the books grows up to become a writer of girls' school stories. And I remember reading one book, and I can picture it now. It was on a right-hand page, about halfway down, middle of the paragraph. She gets a letter from her publisher, and in this letter is a cheque. And for the first time in my life, I understood that writers got paid for writing books. Now, I don't know what I'd thought before, if they just did it out of the goodness of their heart, or if the writing fairy came down in the night and did all the hard work. Oh, I wish there was a writing fairy. But I understood then that could be a job, and I thought, that's what I want to do. At that point, my future was set in stone. I was probably about 9, and I thought, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up. I can tell lies. So that was an important element from the Shalley School books. And of course, it also changed the course of my life in a very practical way. I grew up in a school that was very academically orientated, even though it was just the local state school. We sent a lot of people to university, and the prevailing view in the school was if you were smart, you went to Edinburgh or St Andrews, and if you weren't quite so smart, you went to Dundee or Stirling. The notion of spreading your wings and going to horizons beyond that was anathema, really. Nobody ever thought of doing that. But I felt through most of my teenage years that I didn't fit, that I was an outsider. I thought at the time that it was mostly to do with the fact that I wanted to be a writer, because I understood that you had to have that sense of detachment, that observational element to your personality. But I knew that I wanted something different. I wanted to experience the wider horizons that I'd been reading about. So I thought I'd better go to university in England. Now, I knew nothing about England. We'd been to England once. We'd gone there for a holiday to Blackpool. Now, those of you who know anything about the UK will know about Blackpool. It is a holiday resort. It is garish, it is vulgar, it is full of neon lights and fairground rides, candy floss and fish and chip shops, the famous Golden Mile full of penny arcades and all kinds of vulgarity, really, you'd have to say. And we'd gone there for a holiday, and that was my sole experience of England. But I decided that since at the Shalley School, when you left the Shalley School, there were 3 options available to you if you wanted to go into tertiary education. There was Oxford, there was the Sorbonne, and I knew my French wasn't good enough for the Sorbonne, or there was the Kensington School of Needlework. Now, I am a woman who struggles with sewing on a button, so obviously it wasn't going to be the Kensington School of Needlework. and that left Oxford University. And so I applied to Oxford. I was 16 when I did my entrance exam. I went for an interview. The principal said to me, "We've never taken anyone from a Scottish state school before." And I said, "Well, it's about time you started." And the rest is history, really. So the Shalley School really did change my life.
And if I can interject here, because there's a danger you're going to cover all the answers to all the questions before I get a chance to ask the second one. You're famously the first person from a Scottish state school to attend St Hilda's College, the college in Oxford you were talking about, even though you grew up in a solid working class family in Fife. So how did you bridge those two worlds? And what effect did you think it had on your writing?
Well, the first thing really that I realised when I arrived in Oxford a year later was that nobody understood what I was saying. I came from Fife, and in Fife we talk quite fast and we use a lot of dialect, and nobody came what I was saying because I come from Fife where the skunks fly by. It was to keep the student out of the name, and I was really struggling. Nobody came what I was saying. And I went to my very first tutorial and I started to read out my essay, and my tutor stopped me about 2 paragraphs in and said, "I'm most terribly sorry, Miss McDermid, but I haven't really followed a word you've said. Might you begin again, and perhaps a little more slowly this time?" And I realised that the first thing I was going to have to do was learn to speak English. Now, I'd always thought I spoke English, but it was quite clear to me that what I spoke was not English. And so I learned to speak like they spoke. I've always had a good ear for music, and so I think that helped me. The accent you hear me speak with now is what Joe calls my BBC Radio 4 Scottish accent. So it's what I used to speak like, but with the edges rubbed off. And
that's not what you sound like first thing in the morning.
I'm sure it isn't. And it's certainly not what I sound like when I go back to the football in Kirkcaldy, where I just descend straight back into my native tongue. So there was an element of culture shock, really, as apart from the language issue. Everything was different, really. The shape of the town was different. The buildings looked different. Everything was different, and the food was different. In Scotland in the 1960s, we only had 3 vegetables. They had a lot more vegetables in Oxford, and many of them were, to me, completely unrecognisable. There were things put on the table some nights, and I didn't know if they were food or table decorations. But somehow I survived, and I more than survived. I thrived. I was conscious that I was living in 2 worlds, though, because every now and again I did have to go back home. I went back to Kirkcaldy, and people were slightly wary of me, I think, or they didn't quite know how to react to me now that I had gone away to England. And I felt as well a bit like a stranger in a strange land some of the time. I didn't really feel that this was where I fitted anymore in quite the same way. And part of that was that going to Oxford had introduced me to all sorts of ideas and experiences. And one of the key things that happened to me when I was at Oxford was that I came to understand the nature of my sexuality. I'd always felt, as I said, like an outsider. And I didn't really understand why, because when I was growing up, there were no gay people around. There were no lesbians in Fife. There was no lesbians in books, really, or on television or in films. There was no template for a life that wasn't heteronormative. If you didn't think about growing up and getting married and having small children, there was no other option, really. And in the middle of my second year at Oxford, somebody gave me a copy of Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics. Now, it's a book of literary criticism, but it's also a kind of introduction, I suppose, to feminism. And for me, it was like having the blinkers wrenched off. I suddenly started looking at the world in a different way. I understood that there was a different way to read literature, a different way to interpret the world that had been a very rich source of pleasure and stimulus to me over the years. And through reading that and through moving into the world of feminism, I discovered the lesbians. And that really did change my life, because for the first time ever, I felt this was a place where I could be myself, where I had discovered myself. So that, I suppose, was an additional difference between the life I had had and the life I was now living. And it did make things, I think, quite complicated. For me, it wasn't particularly easy to be myself back in the world I had come from. And it took me a long time to rebuild those bridges to a point where I felt they could take my weight.
But what about the effect on your writing of being in these two worlds? Has that been
I think what it did was help me to understand how you walk in someone else's shoes. It was the first time I'd really been exposed to lives that were completely different from my own, expectations of the world that were completely different from the ones I'd grown up with. And so it forced me to look through other people's eyes and to exercise empathy, I suppose, when I was using my imagination.
The next question is, what, if any, pressure did you feel at that point to prove yourself? And the second part of the question, sorry, it makes me laugh. Are you a driven person?
I think I probably am a driven person.
You think?
Yeah, and I think that does come back to my upbringing. I mean, my parents were both really bright people who weren't able to further their education past the age of 14 because their families had to exist on whatever money could be brought into the house, and at 14 you had to go out and earn a living. There wasn't any question of studying further, and they very much wanted me to make the most of my options, to make the most of the possibilities that were open to me. And I'm not alone in that. I think an awful lot of people in my generation from my cultural background had that pressure to absolutely do well. Ours was the first generation to go to university. In my family, I was one of the first to go to university, and that placed expectations on us of success. I always felt that I had to be the best I could be, because my parents had instilled in me the understanding that it didn't matter where you were born or what your family was like or any of that sort of thing, that they subscribed to the Robert Burns idea that a man's a man for all that. The exterior doesn't matter, it's the interior life that counts. And I could call no man my master, really. So for me, there was that idea that the only thing that stood between me and whatever I wanted to do was me. And that stayed with me. And that has been, I suppose, a driving force throughout my life. And I still feel driven, in spite of what appears on the face of it to be a tremendously successful career. I still want to be better at what I do. That's important to me. And I suppose there's a little bit of that Scottish Presbyterian element of, if you have a talent and you waste it, it's a sin against nature. And heaven knows I don't want to sin against nature.
Of course, after you left Oxford, you didn't immediately become a best-selling writer, and you started your career as a journalist. And the next question is asking about that. Did your early career as a journalist in Devon and Glasgow help you in your future career as a crime writer?
Only in the most tangential of ways. I did cover crime stories over the years when I was a trainee in Devon. Not many, it was mostly parish councils and things like that, flower shows, cricket matches. In Glasgow it was a bit more crimey, and certainly Manchester afterwards it was a lot more crimey. But that really wasn't what influenced me as a writer. What helped me as a writer was twofold. The first was not to be precious about writing. In a newspaper, you can't decide, depending on the mood you're in, what you're going to write. Yeah, you can't go to your news editor and say, that train crash, not really feeling like writing about that. You know, my cat's not very well, and really I'm just not in the mood, so I'll do it tomorrow. That's not how newspapers work. You can't wait for the muse to strike. I learned, I say very quickly, that you don't have to be in the right frame of mind to write something. You can get those words down on the page, and if you get them down on the page, you can make them better, you can polish them, you can buff them up and turn them into something that's acceptable. So I don't wait for the muse to strike. I write as a job, and it's a job of work, and I sit down and I do my job. The other thing that it gave me over the years, and I was a journalist for I think 15, 16 years, what it gave me access to was a huge database of people. As a journalist, you go into people's lives at a time of crisis. Mostly something very bad has just happened to them, or is in the process of happening to them. But sometimes it's something very good and wonderful that's happened to them. I mean, the number of miracle babies I covered early on in my career, you wouldn't believe. But you're there at a time of crisis and change, and crisis and change are what provoke people to reveal themselves in the way they speak, in the way they act. And for me, I have now this huge data set of different kinds of people in different environments, because I would sometimes see them in their place of work, sometimes in their place of leisure, sometimes in the pub, sometimes in their own homes, sometimes in the street. And all those backgrounds, all those faces, all those experiences of watching people react to the changes in their circumstances has provided me with a huge range of possibilities when I'm writing about character.
Of course, you've also written non-fiction work, and the really interesting next question about forensics, the anatomy of crime, the book you wrote a few years ago for the Wellcome Trust. How do you balance the scientific disciplines of forensic science with the emotional and psychological elements of your work?
That's an interesting question, and I often feel that I have a very particular relationship with forensic science, because the first time a case involving DNA appeared in the courtroom was 1986, and my first crime novel appeared in 1987, and I kind of feel that my career as a crime writer has gone in tandem with the development of modern forensic science. And quite early on in my writing career, I met Professor Dame Sue Black, though at the time she was just Dr. Sue Black, who is one of the world's leading forensic anthropologists. But even more outstanding than her scientific abilities are her communication skills. And Sue and I very quickly became good friends, and she shared many of her experiences with me. And the great thing about Sue is that she tells me something about the science, and then she explains it in terms that any layperson can understand. And sometimes she comes up with the most vivid images that, frankly, for a writer are gold dust. I remember once asking her, if you had a body that had been in a bog for 200 years, what would it look like? And she thought for a moment, and then she said, a leather bag with a face on. And I mean, I just dropped that straight into the book as it came out of her mouth, exactly. And over the years, I had a lot of conversations with Sue about her work. And through her, I've met many other forensic scientists who have been equally generous and equally adept at communication and brought me into their world. And it's fascinating to me. I love it. I love the wow moments when somebody tells you something that you just go like, really? But the thing that is difficult is to avoid the seduction of the science. As seductive as the science is, you have to make sure that it's always at the service of telling the story. The reader isn't there to have a tutorial in forensic entomology or forensic biology. They're there to read a good story involving interesting people that they care about, either loving them or hating them. And so the science always has to be at the service of the story, in the same way that forensic science has to be at the service of the courtroom. So you have to be not too fascinated by the science when you're actually sitting at the desk. And sometimes I actually have to go back through and throttle it back a bit, take things out. But one of the other things that's been quite fun recently about that aspect of my experience is that one of the things that forensic scientists all go sort of slightly mad about, the steam comes out of their ears if you say the word CSI or silent witness to them. Because they get very frustrated at the way that forensic science is portrayed on television, film particularly, that one single forensic scientist can do every single discipline and do it in 10 minutes. But the reality itself is extraordinary enough. And I'd heard this so many times over the years, and I decided that what we needed to have was a television series that actually showed forensics as it really is, and forensic science as scientists as they really are and how they operate in the world. And so I came up with the idea of a television series focusing on forensic scientists called Traces, and that has now been on television in the UK. It features women leading roles in the science room. It features a storyline that is based around the way that the police and the forensic scientists work together, and it shows what the job really is, and it is exciting. There are wow moments in it, there are scary moments in it, there are moments of light bulbs going on in heads, and I'm just so thrilled at the way it's turned out. I didn't write the script, I just storylined it. Amelia Bullmore, the actor and writer, did a wonderful job with the scripts, but we're about to make series 2, and my forensic science friends are even more in love with me.
I'm actually going to jump ahead since you've taken us to Traces, because there's a question a wee bit further down that says, how involved with the various TV adaptations do you like to be? Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you are involved? You said that you hadn't written traces, but you nevertheless were very involved with that, and there was the Wire in the Blood series as well.
Yeah, I've generally been in a position of consultant or executive producer. I'm not a scriptwriter. It's a very different discipline to write for television and film. I don't see the story in the way that a scriptwriter does, and I can't translate my vision into writing for the screen in that way. I leave that to people who know what they're doing and do a much better job of it than I could do. But when it comes to adaptation, I need to know that I can trust the people I'm working with. When we did Wire in the Blood, right at the very beginning, I sat down and spent 2 days with the exec producer and Robson Green talking about what the key elements of the book were and how we could interpret them on screen and what we needed to hold on to so that people who'd read the books and then watched the television wouldn't go, wait a minute, that's nothing like the books. And vice versa. If they'd watched the television and then gone to the books, they weren't going to go, but wait a minute, no, this is nothing like what I've seen. And so we discussed that, we talked all that through, and then at the end of those couple of days, I just said, now your job is to go away and make the best television you can make, but adhering to these things that matter. And they did. They absolutely did. They did a great job. And that's essentially what I've tried to do with everything I've worked with. We did the same thing with Place of Execution. And we're in the throes now of adapting the first Karen Pirie novel, The Distant Echo, for television. And that's what we're trying to do with this, that we maintain the integrity of the vision of the books, but translate it to the screen in a way that works.
And eagle-eyed viewers will notice your little cameos in Wire in the Blood and Traces. Are you going to be doing a kind of Hitchcock and make sure that you're in all of your...
I'll probably do a wee cameo role in The Distant Echo. I'm obviously just in 1 or 2 episodes of previous ones, not like Colin Dexter, who I think was in every episode of Morse, and quite a few of Lewis afterwards.
Okay, a bit of a change of direction again, but another fascinating question. You're quoted as saying that Lindsay Gordon is your character that most resembles yourself. Would you care to elucidate?
That's kind of a quote that's taken out of context. Lindsay Gordon resembles me in the sense of the superficial facts of her life. I think when most writers start out, one way or another, they write quite close to themselves or the facts of their life, because write what you know is always easier than trying to walk in a wholly different set of shoes to begin with. I couldn't have written Tony Hill when I started out. I couldn't have written Karen Pirie when I started out. But Lindsay, I gave some of the facts of my life. She's Scottish, she's a journalist, she's lesbian, she's a feminist, but she's not me in any sort of sense of temperament. She's a very different personality from me. All my characters have something of me in them because that's all I can write. I can only write from my own understanding of the world. So there's a shard of me in everybody. And some people say Karen Pirie is the one that's most like me, but again, temperamentally, we're not that similar. And one thing about Karen and I that's completely at odds is her taste for gin. I cannot drink gin. Ever since when I was 18, I got horribly drunk and then horribly ill on gin. And so the smell of gin now still makes me feel faintly queasy. And unfortunately, or fortunately for some people, when people read the Karen Pirie books, they make the mistaken assumption that I'm a gin drinker. And so very often when I do an event or I go somewhere, people like to give me a little gift, and they give me a bottle of gin, and it's very kind of them. And of course now with all these designer gins, some of them I'm told are really lovely, but I can't drink them. So they end up being donated to Joe's geography department at St Andrews, who, once lockdown is over, I'll be very grateful for them. And just for the record, what I really like are Isla malt whiskies. If anybody's listening, if anybody cares.
Just to pick up on your character, when you say there's a bit of you in all your characters, you're not just talking about your good protagonists, you're talking about some of the darker characters as well, I presume. Yes,
that's
so Jacko Vance?
Yes, I'm sure there's elements of me in Jacko Vance. The way that Jacko Vance thinks is he thinks that way because I created him. And so I suppose if I was going to commit that sort of crime, if I was going to do that sort of thing, that's the way I would do it.
Good to know.
I mean, I guess what I would say probably is most obvious about Jacko Vance is the intelligence, the planning, the carefulness of the planning about it. I could probably get away with murder. Joe's looking slightly nervous on the other side of the room.
I'm going to stop adding to the questions and just read what I've got in front of me instead of ad-libbing. Okay, so we've now got a couple of questions about plot. First of all, how do you arrive at your plots? Is the process more research-based? Do you have moments of light bulb inspiration? Is it a mixture of both or something else? And at what point do you decide whether it's a story for one of your series characters or a standalone?
For me, stories start often with quite small things. It's a little, maybe something I read in a throwaway line in a book, or something I hear on the radio, and I think that's interesting. I didn't know that. I wonder if there's something in that for me. I'll give you an example. I remember reading a biography of Josephine Tay, and in the course of that, the author mentions in passing that during the Second World War, north of the Great Glen in Scotland, the Highlands were off limits. You couldn't go there unless you had a military pass. And if you lived in that area, you couldn't go more than 20 miles from your home unless you had a signed letter of authority from the armed forces. And I remember thinking at the time, that's interesting, I should be able to do something with that. And then it slipped my mind. And it so happened a while later, Joe and I were in the Highlands at the Cromarty Crime Festival. Cromarty is a beautiful little town on the Cromarty Firth, opposite Nig, the oil terminal. But Cromarty itself is a beautiful wee place, and they've got a really nice little bookshop. And Joe and I had gone for a walk, and I thought, I meant to do something about that. Obviously, we're in the Highlands, they'll have something about the Highlands in the Second World War. So off we went to the bookshop, and I asked the bookseller, do you have something about this area during the Second World War? And the bookseller just said, no. So I thought, well, that's the end of that. And then she said, but a funny thing happened the other week. And she launched into this wonderful story that became the basis for Broken Ground, the 5th Karen Pirie novel. I don't know. I forget them as soon as they're done.
Yes, it must be.
Yeah, and so this was an anecdote about a couple who had been heading to Shetland to just try and find something that had been buried there at the end of the Second World War. And I was so excited by this. Immediately I thought, there is a story here. I can do something with this. And already I could feel the story starting to form in my head. And then I knew I had to research it. So I had to do all the background research to figure out if this was going to be feasible. I couldn't put it in Shetland because Shetland is Anne Cleeve's country. You know, that she's got that totally nailed down. And I didn't want to get into a fight with Anne Cleeve's, you know. Big trouble. She's got that black leather jacket, you know, she's scary. So I set it in Wester Ross, which is a part of the Scottish Highlands that I know much better. And that started off, as I say, a small conversation in the bookshop, exploded in my head into a big idea. And then there was a lot of research, a lot of figuring out the practicalities of how to make it work. Because actually the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of how it works, are something that sometimes take a lot of thought and a lot of research and putting together step by step. How I know whose story it is very quickly emerges from the kind of story it is. Tony Hill and Carol Jordan do serial killers, or they do crimes that appear to have a serial element to them. Karen Pirie does cold cases. Anything outside that really is going to be a standalone. So the kind of story dictates whose story it is.
And what's most important, plot or character?
Well, I always think of the crime novel as a three-legged stool. It's plot, character and setting. Because the setting is a very important element in the crime novel, I think, because if you do the setting properly, the reader immediately believes in your world. And if you create a world they believe in, they're inclined to believe the lies you're telling them. But in terms of plot and character, I think they each depend on each other in a sort of biofeedback system. The reason people love a book is because of the characters. You can have a book that has a great plot, but if the characters are just cardboard, 2 days later you'll have forgotten the book, you'll have forgotten the story, you won't remember who did what to whom, and you don't care. But character is the heart of it. Character is where suspense comes from. Character is why you read the next chapter, because you have to find out what happened. When a car goes off the cliff, it's only interesting because you care about the fate of the person in the car or the person sitting on the beach at the bottom of the cliff. So it's the character that drives the reader, but the plot has to work, or the reader will sit there going like, oh, wait a minute, that could never happen. That's a ridiculous coincidence. So for me, when I'm putting the book together, when I'm writing the book, it's almost like a sort of biofeedback system. The character creates the plot, creates the character, creates the plot. As your story develops, your characters develop, and then that changes what happens next, because you've created a character for whom certain limitations exist and certain possibilities exist. And so the more you give them one set of possibilities, the more you're limiting the way the story can go in a different direction. So they become reliant on each other in order for it to work. And when it all works well, the story becomes almost organic. The characters and the plot and the setting, there's a sense of this story could only happen here. This story happens because it's set here. It doesn't always work that well, though.
Your latest book, Still Life, which is displayed beautifully behind you, is the sixth to feature cold case detective DCI Karen Pirie. What inspired it, and how did you balance the two main plot threads?
At the back of Still Life really started with an interest in portraiture. The idea for the germ of the story came from, and I don't want to say too much about the detail of this, because it gives away too much about the elements of the plot. But I was reading Alan Bennett's diaries, and in a single paragraph, he just told a little anecdote about a friend who had died and his widow breaking up the house. And I thought, that's a possibility. I can do something with that. So in a practical sense, that's where it started. But in terms of theme and the kind of things I wanted to write about, I've been thinking quite a lot about portraiture and about identity, and how we define who we are, how other people define who we are, how much of that depends on how we look. And I was involved in a project with an artist friend of mine, and she had this project called The Long Look, which was really a project about her process rather than about specifically creating a likeness of me. And every couple of weeks for 2 years, I went along to her studio and sat for 2 hours, and she drew me. And she had the same drawing, which every week she would rub bits off and add bits to, and develop it and change it. And every week our colleague would come and take a photograph of the drawing. At the end of this process of 2 years, there were only 2 drawings. But I was fascinated by the difference in the drawings, how different I looked from week to week. And there were certain patterns I could see over this period of time, that when I was at the start of a book, the drawings and my face were much vaguer, much less defined. And as I got towards the end of the book, the drawings became almost electric. That there was a sort of sharpness and intensity, almost a spikiness to the drawings that seemed to me to have some connection to what was going on in my head. I thought I just sat there for 2 hours with a completely blank expression, but apparently not. But I was interested and intrigued by how the portraits could tell something different about the sitter, and so I started thinking about identity and about art, and that was the starting point for where I went with the book. And then I started to draw on other possibilities, location, and the idea of what we do for love, and all sorts of things coalescing around that. There's 2 main plot strands, and I very often have a double plot in my books, or more than one plot indeed, more than 2 plots indeed. And that goes back to the early days when I started writing the Kate Brannigan novels. Kate Brannigan was a private eye, and at the time that I'd started writing the Brannigan novels, I did my first non-fiction book, which was a book about real-life private eyes, a suitable job for a woman. And I spent a lot of time interviewing women in the States and in the UK about their job, how they did it, how they got into it, what they did. And I asked them if they actually read the private eye fiction, and quite a lot of them did. And I asked them what they thought about it, and they all said the same thing. They all said, your characters just have only one case, the luxury of one case. And I remember Jean Mignolet, this very elegant private eye in Florida, she said to me, I have 38 open cases on my desk right now, not one. And I thought, obviously I can't write 38 cases in a novel, but I wanted some sort of simulacrum of the fact that most professional investigators, whether private eyes or cops, have a lot more than one case going on. They don't have the luxury of devoting themselves in the sort of single-minded way to one case. They've got other things on their plate. And so I've always tried to weave more than one case through the books. And it's really helpful because whenever you're doing any kind of investigation, there are always bits where there's not much happening. You've got to wait for somebody to phone you back, or you've got to wait to uncover a particular piece of information. And when you've got more than one storyline going on, when the main plot gets a bit boring, you just toss something in from the subplot or the other plot. So you have them a sort of weaving strands around each other, but in a very practical way to make the book move along and not have those bits where you're going like, oh, I wish something would happen.
But I think that's the thing that for those of us who don't write crime novels is the most impressive thing, to be able to keep more than one plate spinning and just give each one a little move along at the right time. It's very. I'm just in awe of someone who can do that.
I've been doing it for a long time now. I think I've got a sort of base level of skill that allows me to survive on the bad days, if you see what I mean. But I learn, you learn your craft over years and over a lot of books, and I think I'm just about getting the hang of most of it, although there's some bits that still elude me.
Well, it's good to know you're getting the hang of it.
Yeah.
Of course, you don't just write crime novels, and this year you have a graphic novel coming out called Resistance, about a pandemic outbreak that starts with an open-air music festival. It's both quite a departure and very timely. How did this come about?
Well, some years ago now, 4 years ago now, I was involved in a project with the Wellcome Foundation, Wellcome Trust. And every year, Wellcome bring together writers of radio drama, producers of radio drama, and scientists. And every year they choose a particular theme to do with medical science, usually in some way, but to do with the developments in science. And the year I was asked to come along to the subject that we were looking at was antimicrobial resistance. The notion that for bacterial infections, the drugs don't work anymore. We have, through carelessness and stupidity, used up our arsenal of effective antibiotics. And the government chief medical officer at the time, a woman called Sally Davis, put the absolute fear of death into me. And she essentially said, there is a plague coming and we are going to die. And this is not an if, this is a when. And so I came out of that session with the scientists and thought, the only thing I can write here is an apocalypse. And so I went off and pitched this idea, and Radio 4 commissioned it, and I wrote a 3-part drama called Resistance, about the lack of capable drugs to deal with a bacterial pandemic. And it gets hold and exerts a terrible toll on humankind. And after it went out on air, and it was very much appreciated. It got very good reviews. People enjoyed it. And Wellcome asked me if I would turn it into a novel. And I'm like, I'm really lazy. I've done this once. I don't have to do it again. And then Joe and my son sitting over dinner, Joe said, you could have it done as a graphic novel. And my son immediately chipped in with, yeah, you get a whole new demographic. So I made the suggestion to them, and we looked at the work of quite a few young artists, and we chose Catherine Briggs, who is an American who at the time was living in Dundee, and then Dundee is the comic book capital of Scotland. It started off in the days of D.C. Thompson with the Bruins and Ur Wully, but now you can do a degree in writing, drawing comics at Dundee. And Catherine was based at Dundee, and then her visa ran out. She had to go back to America, and she did the drawings, and she's done a brilliant job. Used lots of different elements of the vocabulary, if you like, of graphic novels. I think it looks great. It was ready to go last summer, but last summer we were in the grip of COVID, and last summer none of us had any idea what the way out of this might be, if there might be a way out of this. I think most of us were in a state of anxiety all the time, and this was not the time to publish a graphic novel about the almost end of humanity. And so we held it back. And now that we have a vaccine, and now that there is a sense of light at the end of the tunnel, for people other than you lot living in New Zealand, then it seemed like it was an appropriate time for people to think about what had happened, and to read this book and consider what we do in the future to try and save ourselves.
So what's your next book about? The person who's written the question says that they've read that it's due to be set in 1979 during the winter of discontent. Is this right? And if so, why?
Well, I got to the end of Still Life and we were in lockdown, and all my books really are set against the here and now. And I thought, I can't write a book set against the here and now, because the here and now changes from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour. I have no solid ground to stand on. I don't know where we'll be. I don't know if people are going to want to read a book that's set in lockdown. I don't know how to write a book set in lockdown. This does not feel to me fertile ground for my creativity. And I'd had this vague idea in my head for a while of writing a quintet of novels set over a period of 41 years, 10-year intervals, with the same protagonist not necessarily doing the same job. And I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do it, this is the time to do it. And so I started writing 1979. And the next one, of course, will be 1989, and so on until we get up to 2019. And it starts in freezing cold January. It was a terrible winter, 1978-79. Snow on the ground for weeks. Then we went into the industrial unrest of the winter of discontent. Bodies unburied in mortuaries, streets piled high with rubbish, 3-day week because the power workers were on strike, and there's lots of political upheaval, lots of personal upheaval for people, Scottish devolution referendum, and then ultimately Margaret Thatcher coming to power in May 1979. So it was a tumultuous year, and I thought it would be an interesting backdrop, because it's always nice to have a backdrop, and I thought I can write about 1979 because I know what happened. I was at the time working as a journalist in Glasgow, and indeed my central character in this book, Ali Burns, is a journalist in Glasgow. And I went back to, when it was possible to go back to the archives of the National Library again, I went back to read the newspapers of the time, because that really anchors you. It tells you the stories that people were interested in, not necessarily the stories that you'll find in the history books. It tells you how people were living, what was on the pictures, the cinema, what was on the television, how much was a pint of lager, what kind of furniture were people, what did the furniture look like, what did the clothes look like. I mean, that's hysterically funny a lot of the time. I think, was I really wearing that in 1979? I don't think so. But the really weird thing for me was every now and again I'd come across a story that I'd written, a story with my byline on it. And the scary thing was how many of those stories I have no recollection of writing. I just like, did I go there? Did I talk to that person? Really? So it's been an interesting experience doing the research and now doing the writing.
Very much looking forward to reading that.
You'll just have to wait like everybody else.
The next question is clearly by someone from someone who knows you well. Although it's been put politely, you've expressed your views on many subjects, as diverse as Scottish independence, the role of the arts and societies, violence against women, the role of New Zealand IPA in supporting women in the menopause, homelessness and feminism, just to mention a few things you have an opinion on. Do your opinions influence what and how you write?
Well, every writer writes about the things that interest them and the things that they hold dear and the things that they believe. And so, yeah, because I am interested in a lot of things that affect us, and my novels are very much set against the real world that we live in. Inevitably, some of the things that I hold dear find their way into the books, but absolutely not in a tub-thumping, special pleading kind of way. I hope that I write with a sense of the fabric of society and ideas woven through that. And not everyone who expresses an opinion in the books is speaking with my voice, not by any manner of means. And often things I do feel strongly about, I hold back on because this book isn't the place to talk about them. This book isn't the place for them. So yes, sometimes my gobby opinionatedness does find its way into the books. I'm always amused, when people talk about politics in books. They always talk about people like me as a political writer because I write from a perspective of, I suppose, of the left and of having had a working class experience, that sort of thing. Writers of the right, the conservative persuasion, are never described as political writers. Writers who support the status quo are never considered to be political, but they're just as political as any of us on the left or anybody in the middle, indeed.
The next question is a small one. What are your ambitions for the future?
My ambitions in personal terms for the future is that to carry on writing for as long as I'm able and to carry on trying to get better at it.
That was a small question. The next question is taking us back to New Zealand. Are you tempted to join the current crop of Kiwi crime writers and write a novel set in New Zealand?
I don't know, I think they might gang up on me if I stand on their turf. I would find it quite difficult. I suspect it depends how much longer I keep coming to the University of Otago. If I keep coming back year after year for quite a bit of time, maybe I'll eventually reach a point where I feel comfortable enough to write about New Zealand. At the moment, if I was going to write about New Zealand, I'd have to write about it very much from the point of view of an outsider, someone coming to visit. Karen Perry coming to visit New Zealand. I don't know why Karen Perry would come to visit New Zealand on a cold case inquiry, because I don't think the Scottish Police budget would run to that. But on a more serious note, I need to have quite a profound understanding of a place before I set a book there, if I was setting it there from the perspective of someone who comes from that part of the world. But it might be possible to write something from someone who's not from New Zealand. But honestly, you've got enough really good New Zealand crime writers without me sticking my oar in.
We're now getting on to the properly serious and important questions. We need to talk about football.
Yes.
You're known as a lifelong Raith Rovers fan. You sponsor the McDermid stand in their ground in Kirkcaldy, and your website is the Raith shirt sponsor. So what do you think of their form this year, especially in the light of COVID and its effect on football players and teams? And most important of all, will Raith win the league this year?
Well, we're having a bit of a purple patch at the moment. We've been promoted to the Championship, which is the second tier of Scottish football. And so it was always, I think most of us felt it was going to be a struggle to make sure that we stayed up in the Championship. But here we are at this point in the season, and we're in second place, which is phenomenal, really. We've got some tremendous young players this season, and the manager, who was absent for a bit at the beginning of the season because he had to have gallbladder surgery, poor man, is now back and leading the charge. And I think we've got a great team atmosphere. There was an outbreak of COVID within the team, and fortunately nobody was ill, and we had to postpone a few matches. And I think that has provoked a level of camaraderie among the players, because they are spending so much time together in their own bubble when they're training together and playing together. I think it must be really hard for them. They're young lads, they want to go out on the town, they want to have a good time to celebrate when we win. We've had some historic victories this season. We beat Morton 5-0, we beat Dundee 3-0, we beat the Hearts. And so there's been plenty of occasions when one would have liked to go out and celebrate, and I have really missed not getting to the games this season. I don't think we'll win the league. I would like to think it was possible, but I think we might end up in the playoffs, which could mean top flight football for us next season, which would be outstanding and amazing, and also terrifying for the implications for the club's finances. We'd earn a lot of money, but we'd have to spend it on doing up the ground.
Okay, finally, we have a little batch of culinary questions. As your alternative career as a celebrity chef gathers pace, this will be reference to Cooking the Books of Val McDermid, available from your website. Links to, I think we've done 11 of them.
Yes, the first series of 8, and then we did 3 specials.
3 specials.
With the producer-director here today behind the camera again, Professor Joe Sharp.
Always behind the camera.
Not always. You kept pushing into the picture in quite a lot of them.
Usually just my hand. Anyway, so we have some questions about your chefiness. Do you have a favourite cuisine for cooking?
I think I would tend probably towards the Indian cuisine. I like cooking curries, one sort or another. And Joe's speciality is Thai curries and Malaysian curries, and I do the other bit of the subcontinent of with India and Pakistan.
Okay, you do a very good chicken ruby. I will
I do.
put that on record. Under lockdown, have you learned any new dishes?
Yeah, the one you just mentioned there, the chicken ruby, which is a speciality of a restaurant chain called Dishoom, which I discovered the other day where the name Dishoom comes from. It's wonderful. This is they've got 3 or 4 restaurants in London and one in Edinburgh, and apparently in Bollywood movies, when they have the fight scenes, you know, in comics you get sort of Batman going pow or kaboom. In Hollywood movies, when they have a fight, it's dishoom, dishoom, dishoom. It's the noise they make for a Hollywood fight. I think that's great. Bollywood, my mistake. So yeah, Dishoom have a recipe book, and they have this, I think, one of the best chicken curries I've ever eaten, and the recipe works perfectly. You get the recipe just like in the restaurant, so I've been practicing that in lockdown.
Oh, that's making me hungry just thinking about it.
Me too.
How do you decide who eats what and when in your books? Because of course, Cooking the Book started with the recipes from your books, and then we diversified a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. I think it's based on all sorts of things. It's based on their age. It's based on their nationality, their cultural background. It's based on what time of day it is, obviously, and their class background as well. Karen eats very different things from choice from her boyfriend Hamish, and he's quite middle class, but also grew up much of his time in America, so he has a different set of culinary values. So those things all feed into see that I did there. All feed into what people are eating and when they're eating it and where they're eating it.
A very specific question. I'm not sure where this one's coming from. Is a slow cooker a good idea?
I think a slow cooker is a wonderful idea. I use a slow cooker very often for soups and stews. And it's invaluable. I don't know why that question has arrived, but I totally endorse the slow cooker.
We're definitely slow food because we don't have a microwave.
No, we don't have microwave at all.
Another COVID question, I think. Is there such a thing as too much homemade sourdough?
Well, I have a wheat intolerance, so regrettably, any sourdough is too much sourdough, and that makes me very sad.
Not when we were in New Zealand, though, because the gluten-free bread there was amazing.
It was, actually, yeah. The rest of the world is going to catch up with New Zealand when it comes to gluten-free bakery goods.
Is there a cookbook in the offing?
No, there is no cookbook in the offing, because the thing with a cookbook is you have to have the recipes tested, and you have to have everything measured in certain repeatable amounts. And I'm afraid quite a few of my recipes contain lines like, you take a handful of this and you chuck it in the pan and you give it a rumble about. And that's not really very technical, so probably no cookbook.
No. And finally, last question. Do you think you can regard cookery as an art form?
Absolutely. Cookery is an art form, and I mean, in New Zealand, for example, you have many examples of cookery as an art form. We've had some astonishing meals while we were in New Zealand. Fleur's Place in Moraki, that is seafood as an art form, a thing of beauty, and I have to say the wreckage we left behind us was not quite so beautiful. And moiety in Dunedin, again, food delivered, beautifully cooked, interesting food, arrayed on the plate in such a way that you know, even if you weren't feeling hungry, it would stimulate your appetite. And I have to say, in Wellington, at the cafe in the art gallery in Wellington, they have sage fried eggs that are, as Keats would doubtless have said, a thing of beauty and a joy forever.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, definitely, food can be art.
Well, thank you very much for these questions, and Val, thank you for answering them so fully.
Well, thank you for having us, and thank you for joining us, and I hope that the next time we see you, it will be in the flesh.